Long ago, before the ice had claimed the horizon and the ash had choked the sky, the world was a tapestry woven from 4 separate threads. It was a time of balance, a time when the spirits of the earth, the fire, the air, and the water danced in a delicate harmony that stretched from the highest peaks of the Earth Kingdom to the deepest trenches of the poles. In those days, the 4 nations lived together, not as strangers separated by borders, but as neighbors bound by the cycle of the seasons and the wisdom of the Avatar. But memory is a fragile thing, especially when it is buried under 100 years of snow. For the people of the Southern Water Tribe, the world of harmony was nothing more than a ghost story, a whisper passed down from grandmother to grandchild in the flickering light of whale oil lamps. They knew only the cold. They knew only the war. Water, earth, fire, air. Katara stood at the edge of the ice, the hood of her blue parka pulled tight against the biting wind. She could hear her grandmother's voice in her head, reciting the ancient prologue as if it were a prayer. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about the old days," she thought, her eyes scanning the endless gray expanse of the ocean. A time of peace when the Avatar kept balance between the Water Tribes, Earth Kingdom, Fire Nation, and Air Nomads. The wind howled, carrying with it the stinging grit of ice crystals. It was a lonely sound, the sound of a world that had lost its protector. But that all changed when the Fire Nation attacked. The memory of that line brought a chill deeper than the South Pole winter. Katara had never seen the beginning of the war. No one in her village had, save for Gran, but she lived in its shadow every day. She saw it in the empty spaces at the dinner circle where the men should have sat. She saw it in the crumbling walls of their snow brick huts. She saw it in the face of her older brother, Sokka, who sharpened his boomerang with the grim determination of a soldier who had no army to fight alongside. Only the Avatar mastered all 4 elements, the legend promised. Only he could stop the ruthless firebenders. Katara looked down at her gloved hands. She felt the pull of the ocean below the ice, a rhythmic tug that synced with the beating of her heart. She was a waterbender, the last one in the entire South Pole. But she was no master. She was a girl with a gift she didn't understand, a power that felt less like a weapon and more like a secret she had to keep. But when the world needed him most, he vanished. 100 years, a century of silence. The Fire Nation was nearing victory, their black ships carving through the oceans like predators, their machines of war grinding the Earth Kingdom into dust. 2 years ago, Katara's father, Hakoda, and the other men of the tribe had sailed away into the mist. They had gone to the Earth Kingdom to help fight, leaving the women and children behind. They had left Katara and Sokka to look after the tribe. Some people believe that the Avatar was never reborn into the Air Nomads and that the cycle is broken, Katara thought, watching a chunk of ice drift lazily in the black water. But I haven't lost hope. I still believe that somehow the Avatar will return to save the world. "Katara, are you dreaming again?" The voice shattered her reverie. Katara turned to see Sokka sitting in the stern of their small canoe, his breath puffing out in white clouds of irritation. He held a spear in his hand, his knuckles white beneath his mittens. "I'm not dreaming, Sokka," Katara replied, climbing into the boat. The wooden hull groaned against the ice, a sound of protest from a vessel that had seen better days. "I was thinking." "Well, think about dinner," Sokka grumbled. "We haven't caught a thing all morning, and my stomach is starting to sound like a polar bear dog." They pushed off the ice shelf. The canoe drifted into the maze of glaciers. The water here was treacherous, a shifting labyrinth of crushing ice and hidden currents. Sokka paddled with a rhythmic, practiced stroke, guiding them deeper into the cold. The silence of the South Pole was absolute. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, only the creaking of the ice and the soft lapping of the water against the boat. It was a silence that amplified every sound, the rustle of fabric, the drip of water, the beating of a heart. Sokka was poised at the bow, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He was a warrior without a war, a boy trying desperately to fill the shoes of the men who had left. He took his duty seriously, perhaps too seriously. To Sokka, the world was a problem to be solved with logic, steel, and a well-aimed boomerang. Magic, or bending, as Katara called it, was just another variable he couldn't control, and Sokka hated things he couldn't control. "It's not getting away from me this time," Sokka whispered, his gaze locked on a shadow moving beneath the surface. He licked his lips, imagining the taste of roasted sea prune. "Watch and learn, Katara. This is how you catch a fish." Katara sighed, leaning back against the side of the canoe. She watched her brother, seeing the tension in his shoulders. He was trying so hard, but sometimes she wished he would just stop trying to conquer the world and start trying to listen to it. She looked over the side of the boat. The water was dark, ink black and freezing, but to Katara, it didn't look cold. It looked alive. She felt that familiar tug in her gut, the connection that linked her blood to the tides. Slowly, cautiously, she pulled off her left glove. The air bit at her exposed skin, but she ignored it. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment to center herself. Push and pull, she thought, like the moon. She opened her eyes and extended her hand. With a gentle, wavy motion of her wrist, she reached out to the water. The surface rippled. It wasn't the wind. It was her. A sphere of water, perfectly round and shimmering like a jewel, rose from the ocean. It hovered in the air, defying gravity, suspended by the invisible thread of her will. Inside the bubble, a silver fish swam in confused circles, trapped in a floating prison. A smile broke across Katara's face. It was working. She was doing it. "Sokka, look!" she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. Sokka didn't turn. He was a statue of concentration, his spear raised high, his tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth. "Shh!" he hissed. "Katara, you're going to scare it away. I can already smell it cooking." "But Sokka, I caught one!" Sokka's muscles coiled. He drew his arm back, preparing to strike the shadow in the water. But in his eagerness, he didn't check his surroundings. He swung the spear back. Pop! The blunt end of the spear collided with the water bubble hovering behind him. The surface tension broke. The magic dissipated. Gallons of freezing seawater, along with one very confused fish, collapsed directly onto Sokka's head. The splash echoed off the nearby icebergs. Sokka sat, frozen for a moment, the water dripping from his wolf tail, soaking into his parka and running down his neck. The fish flopped once on his lap, then flipped over the side of the canoe and disappeared back into the safety of the ocean with a splash that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. Sokka slowly turned to face his sister. His expression was a masterpiece of wet indignation. "Why is it that every time you play with magic water, I get soaked?" he groaned, shaking his hands to rid them of the slush. "It's not magic, Sokka," she snapped. "It's waterbending, and it's—" Yeah, an ancient art unique to our culture, blah, blah, blah," Sokka interrupted, grabbing his paddle and wringing out his sleeves. "Look, I'm just saying that if I had weird powers, I'd keep my weirdness to myself." "You're calling me weird?" Katara retorted, her hands balling into fists. "I'm not the one who makes muscles at myself every time I see my reflection in the water." "Hey, I was checking my form," Sokka protested, his voice cracking slightly. "A warrior has to stay sharp." The bickering was a familiar rhythm, a way to keep the silence at bay. But as their voices rose, echoing off the canyon walls of ice, they failed to notice the current changing. The canoe had drifted into a narrow channel between two massive ice flows. The water here was churning, white-capped and violent. The canoe lurched, knocking them both sideways. "Watch out!" yelled Sokka, his eyes widening. "Go left! Go left!" Katara grabbed her paddle, digging it into the water. "I am going left!" The current caught the bow, speeding them around. A towering wall of ice loomed ahead, jagged and unforgiving. "You call that left?" Sokka screamed. "You don't like my steering? Well, maybe you should have water-bended us out of this." "So it is my fault?" Katara shouted back. "I knew it!" Crack! The canoe slammed broadside into an ice floe. The wood splintered with a sickening crunch. The force of the impact threw them both from the boat. They landed in a heap on a flat shelf of ice, tumbling over each other in a tangle of limbs and blue fur. Behind them, the remains of their canoe were crushed between the grinding glaciers, reduced to driftwood in seconds. Sokka sat up, brushing the snow from his face. He looked at the wreckage, then at the desolate white horizon. "Great," he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just great. Now we have no boat, no fish, and we're stuck on a drifting ice cube. And why? Because you couldn't control your temper." Katara stood up, her breath coming in short, angry puffs. The injustice of it burned in her chest. She had caught the fish. She had been practicing. "My temper?" she yelled. "You were the one playing with the spear. You were the one who popped my bubble." "You were the one playing with magic water," Sokka countered, mocking her hand movements. "It is not magic," Katara screamed. She swung her arms back in frustration. Behind her, the ocean responded. A massive wave rose up, mirroring her movement, and slammed into the iceberg behind them. Crack! The sound was like a gunshot. "Katara!" Sokka said, his eyes going wide. He pointed past her. "I'm just a simple girl from the Southern Water Tribe. I'm not special. I'm not a warrior. But I'm sick of you treating me like a child." She swung her arm again. Another wave lashed out, slicing a massive chunk of ice from the glacier. "Katara, settle down," Sokka yelled, backing away. "I am settled. I'm calm. I'm perfectly calm." With a final furious scream, she brought both hands down. The ice behind her didn't just crack, it shattered. A fissure ripped through the massive glacier, the sound deafening, like the earth itself was splitting open. The water churned and boiled, turning white with foam. Katara spun around, gasping. "Did I do that?" "Yep," Sokka squeaked. From the turbulent water, something began to rise. It was glowing. A massive sphere of ice, distinct from the surrounding glaciers, broke the surface. It was a brilliant, pulsating blue, lit from within by a light that seemed older than the sun. It rose higher and higher, dwarfing them, until it rested on the water like a fallen moon. Inside the ice, trapped in a state of suspended animation, was a figure. Katara stepped closer, mesmerized. The light washed over her, reflecting in her wide blue eyes. "There's someone in there," she whispered. Deep within the ice, a boy sat in the lotus position. He was small, with tattoos of arrows running along his bald head and hands. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful. Above his hands, a small sphere of light glowed, and behind him, curled in the shadows of the ice, was a massive furry beast. "He's alive," Katara said, her voice filled with wonder. Katara, get back, Sokka warned, raising his club. We don't know what that thing is. It could be a Fire Nation trap. But Katara was already moving. She grabbed Sokka's club from his belt. He needs help. She ran to the base of the glowing iceberg. She raised the club and struck the ice. Kang! It was hard as steel. She struck again. Kang! And again. Kang! On the fifth strike, the ice gave way. A fissure shot up the side of the sphere. A blast of wind, powerful and compressed for a century, exploded outward. It knocked Katara and Sokka onto their backs. The iceberg shattered. A beam of pure blue light erupted from the center, shooting straight up into the sky. It pierced the cloud layer, a beacon visible for miles, painting the frozen world in the color of the spirits. Miles away, the light did not go unnoticed. The Fire Nation ship was a scar of metal on the pristine ice. It churned through the water, its smokestack belching black soot into the sky. On the foredeck, Prince Zuko stood alone. He was 17, but his eyes were ancient with anger. A jagged burn scar covered the left side of his face, a permanent mark of his banishment. He wore the armor of his nation, crimson and gold, sharp angles and hard lines. He stood with his hands gripped behind his back, staring at the horizon as if he could force the Avatar to appear through sheer willpower. Then the light appeared. It was a pillar of energy, undeniable and blinding. Zuko's breath caught in his throat. "Finally," he whispered. "Prince Zuko, you're going to catch a cold out here." Zuko turned. His uncle, Iroh, stood in the doorway of the bridge. The old man was everything Zuko was not, round, soft, and seemingly unbothered by the war. He held a steaming cup of tea in his hands, sniffing it with delight. "Uncle, look!" Zuko pointed at the fading beam of light. "Do you see that? It's the Avatar!" Iroh took a sip of his tea. "Or it's just the celestial lights," he said calmly. "We have been down this road before, Prince Zuko. I do not want you to get too excited over nothing. Please sit. Why don't you enjoy a cup of calming jasmine tea?" Zuko felt the heat rise in his blood. "I don't need calming tea," he shouted. He spun around, kicking the cup from his uncle's hand. It shattered on the metal deck, the tea steaming in the cold air. "I need to capture the Avatar," Zuko snarled, his voice cracking with desperation. "I need to restore my honor." He turned back to the light. "Helmsman, set a course for that light." The ship groaned as it began to turn, its engines roaring. Zuko watched the beacon, his golden eyes narrowing. "He is there," he thought. "After 100 years, he is finally there." Back on the ice, the mist from the explosion was clearing. Katara crawled to the edge of the crater. The boy from the ice had collapsed. He lay on the snow, small and still. Slowly, he began to stir. He groaned, rubbing his head. Then his eyes snapped open. They were gray, bright and clear. The glowing tattoos on his head and hands faded to a pale blue. He sat up, looking around with a dazed expression. He gasped, taking in the endless white horizon. "I need to ask you something," he said. His voice was raspy, but it didn't sound like the voice of an ancient spirit. It sounded like a kid. Katara leaned in, her heart pounding. "What?" The boy smiled. It was a wide, goofy smile that seemed to light up the gloom. "Will you go penguin sledding with me?" Katara blinked. She looked at Sokka, who was standing with his jaw dropped. She looked back at the boy. Sure?" The boy leapt to his feet. It wasn't a normal stand. He seemed to uncoil, the air pushing him upright. He dusted off his clothes, orange and yellow robes that were far too thin for the South Pole. He announced, "I'm Aang," cheerfully.
Sokka marched forward, pointing his spear at the boy's chest. "Freeze! You're a Fire Nation spy." Aang looked at the spear, then at Sokka, totally unfazed. "Spy? I'm just a kid." "A kid who was frozen in an iceberg?" Sokka scoffed. "A kid who glows? Likely story. And what is that?" He pointed into the crater. The massive beast from the ice was waking up. It yawned, revealing a mouth big enough to swallow Sokka whole. It had 6 legs, a flat tail like a beaver, and shaggy white fur. A brown arrow ran down its forehead. "That's Appa," Aang said, running over to the beast. He hugged its massive nose. "He's my flying bison." "Right," Sokka said, rolling his eyes. "And this is Katara, my flying sister." Appa took a deep breath. His nose wrinkled. "Look out," Aang warned. "Achoo!" Appa sneezed. A gale-force wind erupted from his nose, carrying with it a copious amount of green bison slime. It blasted Sokka, covering him from head to toe in goo. Sokka stood there, stunned, slime dripping from his ears. He tried to wipe it off, but it was sticky. "Ugh! I'm not getting on that fluffy snot monster," he yelled. "You really expect us to believe this thing flies?" Sokka continued, shivering. "He does," Aang insisted. He hopped onto Appa's head, settling into the driver's position. "Appa, yip yip!" The bison grunted. He lifted his heavy tail, ready for takeoff. And then he flopped into the water. He began to paddle, swimming like a giant furry duck. Sokka smirked from the bank. "Wow, that was truly amazing." Aang patted Appa's head. "He's just tired. Little guy's been hibernating." Katara looked at her brother. "Sokka, we don't have a boat, unless you want to swim back to the village." Sokka looked at the freezing water, then at the snot monster. He groaned. "Fine, but I'm watching you, spy."
They climbed onto the bison's broad back. The saddle was large and surprisingly dry. As Appa swam through the icy channels, Katara moved to sit next to Aang. "So," she said, trying to be casual, "you're an airbender." Aang looked at her, confused. "Sure am." "But that's impossible," Katara said gently. "The Air Nomads were wiped out 100 years ago." Aang's smile faltered. "What? No, I was just in a storm. It was a few days ago." "Aang," Katara said, her voice soft with pity, "you've been in that iceberg for 100 years." Aang fell silent. He looked out at the passing ice. 100 years? The thought was too big to hold. It meant everyone he knew, Monk Gyatso, his friends at the temple, the other airbenders, they were all gone. "I can't believe it," he whispered. 100 years. "I'm sorry, Aang," Katara said. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "If you're an airbender, does that mean you know what happened to the Avatar?" Aang stiffened. He looked away, pulling his knees to his chest. "No, I didn't know him. I mean, I knew people who knew him, but I didn't know him." It was a lie. Katara could feel it, but she didn't press. "Giant light beams, flying bison, airbenders," Sokka muttered from the back of the saddle, wringing out his wet tunic. "I think I got midnight sun madness. I'm going home to where stuff makes sense." As the bison swam, the rhythm of the water lulled Aang into a restless sleep. The dream. Thunder crashed. The sky was a swirling vortex of black and purple. The waves were mountains, crashing down on them with the force of a landslide. Aang gripped the reins, screaming, "Hang on, Appa!" They were going down. The ocean swallowed them. The cold was a shock, like a physical blow. They were sinking deeper and deeper into the dark.
Fear gripped Aang's heart. He was going to die. He had run away, and now he was going to die. No. Something deep inside him, the Avatar spirit, woke up. His eyes glowed white. The tattoos on his body burned. He brought his fists together, and the water around them froze, forming a protective sphere of ice. The world went silent. Aang woke with a gasp. "We're here," Katara said. They were approaching a snowy shoreline. Tents made of animal skins and blocks of snow were clustered together, surrounded by a low wall of ice. "Welcome to the Southern Water Tribe." The arrival of a swimming bison caused a panic. Villagers, mostly women and children, emerged from their tents, gasping and pointing. Sokka jumped off first, trying to regain his dignity. "Listen up, this is Aang, and that's Appa. They're guests." An elderly woman pushed through the crowd. It was Gran. Her face was lined with worry. "Gran," Katara ran to her. "You won't believe it. We found him in an iceberg. He's an airbender." "An airbender?" Gran said, her voice flat. "I thought they were extinct." "Extinct?" Aang winced. "Extinct?" "Yes," Gran said. "The Fire Nation hunted them down 100 years ago." Aang looked at the villagers. They were staring at him with a mix of awe and fear. "Why are they all looking at me like that? Did Appa sneeze on me?" he asked, checking his robes. "No one has seen an airbender in 100 years, Gran said. "We thought the stories were just stories." Sokka snatched Aang's staff. "And what is this? A weapon? You can't stab anything with this." Aang snatched it back. "It's not for stabbing, it's for airbending." He tapped the staff on the ground. Red wings snapped out. "And flying." The village children gasped. Aang grinned. He began to spin the staff. The air whistled. He spun it faster and faster until it was a blur. Then he hopped onto the spinning air ball, the air scooter, and zipped around the snow. The children cheered, chasing after him. Even the adults smiled. For a moment, the war was forgotten. "He's bringing them joy, Sokka," Katara said. Sokka crossed his arms. "He's a threat. The Fire Nation will see him." The next morning, Aang woke Katara up early. "Penguin sledding," he whispered. They crept out of the village to the ice fields. The otter penguins were there, waddling in the snow. "How do we catch them?" Aang asked. "You have to be quick," Katara said, holding out a dried fish. "And you have to have bait." The penguins swarmed her. Aang laughed, grabbing one. He hopped onto its back. "Come on, Katara!" They took off. The penguins slid on their bellies, faster than any sled. The wind rushed past their ears. They banked off glaciers, soared through tunnels of ice, and laughed until their sides hurt. They emerged into a clearing, and then they stopped. Looming ahead of them was a ship. It was ancient, made of rusted black metal. It sat at a jagged angle, frozen into the ice. The Fire Nation insignia was visible on the hull. "What is that?" Aang asked. "A Fire Nation ship," Katara said, her voice dropping. "It's been here for years. My dad told us never to go near it." "I want to check it out," Aang said. "Aang, no! It could be booby-trapped." "It's old," Aang said. "What could happen?" He walked toward it. Katara followed, terrified but unwilling to leave him. Inside, the ship was a tomb. It smelled of oil and decay. They walked through the dark corridors, past empty weapon racks. "This place is creepy," Aang whispered. "We should leave," Katara said. They entered the engine room. Aang marveled at the machinery. He stepped forward and his foot caught a tripwire. Click! Gears ground to life, steam hissed. A trap set decades ago was activated. A canister shot up through the roof of the ship. It exploded in the sky, a bright red flare hanging in the air like a bloody eye. "Uh-oh," Aang said. "The signal!" Katara gasped. "The Fire Nation will see it!" On his ship, Prince Zuko was training. Fire blasted from his fists. He was sweating, angry, relentless. Then he saw it. Through his telescope, he saw the red flare, and beneath it, he saw two tiny figures. One was a boy, an airbender. Zuko lowered the telescope. A cruel smile touched his lips. The last airbender, quite agile for his old age. He turned to the hatch. "Wake my uncle. Tell him I found the Avatar." He looked back at the distant flare, his heart pounding with the thrill of the hunt, as well as his hiding place. The wind howled across the ice. The boy in the iceberg had awakened, and the war had found him. The world would never be the same.